You are listening to E-Radio Show by Missed Apex. We are elected. Hello everyone, and welcome to the E-Radio Show. I'm Matt Trumpets, and today's episode is called I Sanya Comin', But There Was Nothing I Could Do. Today, as always, we are joined by our very own favorite, awesome Chris No More _ journalist on motorsports, Stevens. How you doing today, Chris?
Yeah, I'm doing just great, Matt. And can I say, what a cracker of a show title you've come up with this weekend.
Yeah, I was sweating, and I spent a good solid half hour easily mulling over the possibilities. But before we go any further, I need to remind everybody we are an independent podcast produced in the podcasting shed with the kind permission of our better halves, bringing you race reviews, news from the paddock, and tech analysis. We live stream our race reviews, so be sure to subscribe to E-Radio Show on YouTube so you get a notification when we go live, so you can join our live chat room as well. Well, what do you say? Let's talk about some racing. And I think I might turn that down for the next time. Okie doke. So it was a really interesting race. Very different to a lot of what we've seen. Very, 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 what's the word? Tetchy, I guess I would have to say. A lot of banging. Rubbing is racing. But go back, start us off. How did we arrive at the start line? How did qualifying go? Set us up.
Well, it was Oliver Rowland claiming his first Formula E pole position, a sixth different pole sitter in 6 different races, and the second for Nissan Edams. That's a car that's really come into its own in these last few races. And, you know, we've seen they've been robbed of podium opportunities through various technical issues. And Hong Kong was more of a driver error, but a provoked driver error, I think would be fair to say for Rowland while he was leading. But certainly the pace is there, and they proved that because Buemi was really, really quick in practice, and probably he would have been looking at a top 3 start had he not crashed in Superpole, had an identical crash to what he had in FP2. If you watch the two side by side, it's like a really good game of spot the difference. They were exactly the same. And remember in Santiago when it looked like Buemi had crashed out of the lead, but he blamed it on a braking issue, a braking software issue in particular, because that seems to be the weak spot of that Nissan Edams at the moment. Seems like those issues have been rearing their head again.
All right, well, I'm glad you brought that up because he wound up suffering a penalty because of his brakes. And now I'm finding out, much to my chagrin, because I'm not as well informed about Formula E as I am about Formula One, that there is sort of this massive technical controversy brewing around Nissan and their motor and the brakes. But the penalty was specifically for not following the proper brake procedure. What exactly was it?
Right. So first of all, that kind of the investigation, you know, the FIA is sort of tapping into what Nissan are doing, more concerns the dual motor setup that they have on that car. And Nissan are saying that this is all perfectly procedure. Sometimes the FAA just pick a team and say, we want to check what you're doing under the hood, or to that effect, essentially. But I wouldn't be surprised if the odd team or two have sort of poked their nose in and go, well, you know, that's pushing the boundaries of the regulations and not something we think that we should be doing. But that's the name of the game in motorsport. So I think it's all fair game. It's legal. It's been used by one manufacturer for 3 years, so absolutely fair game. But around the penalty for Buemi, so it was this sort of similar issue to what Degrassi had in Santiago that denied him pole position. What was different about this case was that Buemi's offence was in Superpole. So he should only have been demoted to 6th place, but because he was held in Parc Fermé for so long, resolving this issue, they didn't have enough time to charge the car for the race. And this was sort of compounded by the fact that the race was on an hour earlier than the usual schedule, 3 p.m. start time, as opposed to the usual 4 p.m. start time. So he had to start from the pit lane. And not only that, it's a little different to Formula One, where the last car goes beyond the pit exit and then you get released. It's a little bit longer in Formula E. I guess more than anything because very, very rarely happens.
Well, that is strange, but in essence, he blamed having to do that very same test for his crash in Superpole, didn't he? He said that putting the required amount of pressure on his brakes flat spotted his tires.
Yeah, he was saying because he was having to sort of press the brake pedal a lot to make sure he didn't get this brake usage penalty, that he flat spotted it. Although it is pretty tough to flat spot these Michelin tires, so I don't know what on earth he must have been doing on that. So again, the braking is the weak spot of the Nissan, it seems. But I can't help but think that the incident itself was then also caused by some sort of software issue, because it was just exactly the same as what happened to him in FP2.
Yeah, I mean, so you're basically saying it could be something even as simple as just a wrong number in the table they use for interpolating braking force. And at that one particular juncture, it jumps and you get a nonlinear response, and then bang, there you are in a wall.
Exactly. The whole point of the brake-by-wire system is to give the driver a consistent feel on the brake pedal, regardless of the amount of energy that's left in the battery, regardless of how much you are regenerating the energy into the battery as well. Sometimes you get the numbers on the software wrong and it gives you a different feel. And so sometimes you don't brake enough, or you brake too much, you lock up and you go in.
Right. Now, at the risk of testing the outer boundaries of your knowledge, tell me a little bit more about this controversy with Nissan. And I know that the powertrain itself has been approved by the FIA, but if we look to Formula One, for example, there's a whole host of things that were legal until suddenly they weren't. Oil burning, frick, F ducts, all sorts of things have been found and allowed, and then teams have been told, no, you can't do that for the next race. Now, I'm imagining with a powertrain, it's not exactly going to be that simple for them if they're found to be out of compliance. But what is it that the teams think they're up to? And is it related to the fact, and we saw this in the race, related to the fact that they get such good traction, especially out of slow speed corners?
It's all to do with the dual motor setup. You get such a punch out of the low speed corners in particular. That's when it has its greatest effect. So you'll see it. I mean, there's the concertina effect to take into account as well. But anytime you watch a car following the Nissan, it just darts off into the distance out of a slow speed corner, more so than any of the other cars. And according to the report that was on eRacing 365, the other teams feel that Nissan's design wasn't the kind of thing that Formula E should have been aiming for. So I think that there may have been this sort of gentleman's agreement that they were going to all go for very similar designs and not push the regulations all that much. I is the kind of feeling I'm getting from it. If you want to know what, you should check out the main article itself on eRacing 365, because they have all the details and more knowledge than any of us could possibly wish to have, especially surrounding around something that's so, I don't want to say controversial, but Nissan have been so hush-hush about the details of their car, whereas, some other teams very, not freely admit it, but, they're not holding their cards quite as close to their chest as Nissan do.
Right. So it may also be just that their behavior is engendering the suspicion. But I was going to ask, because I saw things about freewheels and they suspect they're adding energy in subtle ways. But I will leave that for listeners to go read the article and come back to us with questions. And instead, I'm going to ask, is this the first time we're starting to see the heavy hand of the manufacturers on the development scale in a way that might upset the glorious ecosystem that we've been enjoying up until now?
I think we've already seen it. No, it's already in effect with mission control bases back in the factories, working out all kinds of calculations and simulations and strategies that the smaller teams just can't cope up with. So the likes of Dragon and Neo, for example, that's where the bigger teams are going to be making more an advantage, because there's only so much you could do with a powertrain. And like I said, they're all very similarly designed now. So you have to make up the performance elsewhere. And with more resource comes the ability to do stuff like that.
Yeah, more stuff. But if we had a gentleman's agreement, well, if you look even amongst manufacturers, there's going to be an inequality of resource that they have to apply to these sorts of things. And Nissan is pretty big. DS, maybe not quite as big. Jaguar, definitely not as big. So are we going to start to see the scales tilting towards the biggest and most resource plenty manufacturers, or do you think that they will be able to sort of maintain the rough equality that has been enjoyed thus far?
Manufacturers are always going to find a way around whatever you throw at them. Regardless, resource is always going to win in the end, I think. But the Formula E does such a great job of leveling the playing field. So, they're already talking about, banning the mission control things, level out the playing field again. Not least because they want the focus of the performance in Formula E to be about the powertrains, because that's the non-spec part, and the braking systems and stuff like that. That's where they want to be seeing performance, not because Audi can hire 200 people to sit in a factory at 3 a.m. watching the race and working out a bunch of numbers live as the race goes on, and a team like Neo can't.
Fair enough. Tell you what, why don't we go talk about where the race was won and lost? So it seemed at the front of the race, there wasn't, for the first time in my memory, there wasn't a whole lot of place trading at the start. All the action happened a little bit further down the field.
Yeah, it was a first half of energy saving, I would say. A bit more of a traditional Formula E race, what we used to see back in the Gen 1 days, where the first half would just be about consolidating a little bit of energy, working out where you are, and then let the strategy play out later in the race. Unfortunately, there were some safety cars and red flags that got in the way of said strategy playing out, but it worked for John-Eric Verne. In that 8-car battle for the lead, they're all just nose to tail, and really not, there's no point trying to make up so many places at that point if you're still working out your strategy at that point, because no one's going anywhere. But I think Verne timed it perfectly as well. Halfway through the race, bang, up the inside of Roland, and just launches it. And he was, I was actually really surprised to see Techeetah up there, not because of the pace we'd seen in previous races, but because of free practice. They were all over the place under braking in particular. Verne had 6 offs in both free practice sessions because he couldn't get it slowed down, and he was driving angry, it must be said. In his first lap in FP2, he got held up by someone a little bit and starts waving the middle flag at him. And it didn't seem like the build up to great success, but that's what it ended up being, because he suddenly puts it on the front row of the grid, and Techeetah are back and right up there. And suddenly with this win, Verne is 8 points away from the championship lead. So he's right back in the thick of it. But in terms of where the race was won and lost, it was certainly won, I think, on Verne choosing his moment, and using, that energy advantage. I think he was saving more than Roland in the first part of that race, just using that bit of extra experience he's got over Roland. And as I said earlier, I think the safety car brought most of that playing out of the strategy to an end, because as we've seen so many times this season, it just becomes a flat out sprint after that, and it becomes impossible to overtake.
Yeah, and the thing for me, not only was his attack well timed, but the gap that he immediately put on Roland was very impressive. And then really the most exciting thing was when he went for attack mode and just about lost the place back, was that his choice? Do you think that was the team's choice? Was that the plan all along? Build a gap, take attack mode immediately, and get back out in front?
I think the plan for the leader is to always try and build the gap as soon as you've got the margin that you have pre-calculated during practice. You'll see they'll take it, try and work out how much time they're going to lose taking the attack mode, and if they manage to get that figure right, then you get a situation like that where you just pull it off, because you don't want to burn any more energy than you need to in order to try and maintain that place. If you only need a second to take attack mode and maintain position, there's no point pulling 1.5 seconds, because that's half a second of a gap that you've burned energy to make, and it's pointless. So take it as early as possible is always going to be the strategy for the leaders, I think. Or if you're at the lead of a pack of cars, if you're in the pack, you're going to lose a load of positions doing it, and it's going to be still quite difficult to make up those places, I think. Especially because you get extra 25 kilowatts of power, but it's not like you get extra energy store with that as well. You've still got to make your standard 54 kilowatt allocation last the whole race. So you're going to be burning more energy while you're doing that anyway. So that means you start lifting earlier. So you get put in an overtaking position. You got to lift earlier, and you. I don't think it's quite status quo, but it's not as easy as it sounds.
No, well, it's obviously not as easy as it sounds, or else we would see that playing out in real life amongst the drivers. But it was impressively close. It was very narrowly. It was a very narrow escape for them. But escape he did, and at that point, it looked like it was going to be a difficult task for Roland to get the position back, because it must be said he's still fairly new, and that one of the advantages the veteran drivers tend to have is one of efficiency. They're better at saving those tiny little bits of energy here and there across the course of a whole race.
I would have been fascinated to see how that race would have panned out if it was green from lights to flag, because I think the general feeling is that the Nissan doesn't perform in the race as well as it does in qualifying. For sure, it's a front-running car, but could it match Techeetah, from beginning to end in efficiency? I'm not entirely convinced. So I think, having a safety car and being able to save a lot of energy and just have it be a sprint to the finish might have helped them in a way. I think the other factor contributing to Roland not really attacking for the lead again after that was that he's had 2 podium shots taken away from him in the last 2 races. Really, from nothing he inherently did wrong. And I think he more wanted to consolidate this position, take the second place, score his and Nissan's first Formula E podium. And maybe next time he'll get his elbows out a little bit more. We can see he can very much do that. We saw it in Hong Kong, very aggrieved after being having that issue that took him out of the lead. When Bird bumped him and it made him hit the full course yellow button, and he was driving pretty angry after that as well. So I'm sure that's the Roland we'll see when the next time he gets a shot at a win.
So I know we're about to get to DaCosta anyway, because he was the last of the members to make up the podium. But did you notice after the race on the coverage that DaCosta actually came up to Roland and had a chat with him?
Yeah, because he tried for second place, didn't he, at that turn 5 hairpin, and rather had the door slammed in his face, which I think is kind of fair game. But I think he was rather unhappy with the contact. But that's the name of the game in Formula E at the moment.
Yeah, I just love the way he went. He says, he came up, he's like, I know you're kind of new, so I have a suggestion about the blah, 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 blah. And Roland was like, yeah, but then this, that, and the other. And he just kind of wandered off. It's like, it's not always like that in a paddock, is it?
Oh, no. It's not like that on social media either, as I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later.
Yes, I've brought my popcorn for this incident. There is no doubt about that. So DaCosta actually had a really just solid race, start to finish. But he made a comment that interested me. He said that he felt that BMW had left a lot out on the course. and that it was clear that they had the most efficient car. Is that really the case, or is this just a driver talking about his team that way?
Well, you could make an argument to suggest that the BMW is the strongest on race pace. It's certainly very good in race pace. In the fights we've seen between BMW and Techeetah on the track, so far the Techeetah has kind of come out on top. Regardless of the overall result, people have looked at it and said, yeah, the Techeetah is better, at Diriyah in particular. So it may be an element of that, but I do wonder if, they were one of those guys, again, planning that strategy, conserving a lot in the first part of the race, hoping for it to all play out for them later on. But then I guess that's the risk you take, because, we see you get those incidents later in the race, because I think that's kind of what everyone tries to do, or certainly is the more popular strategy. So if suddenly everyone starts going for it all at once, you're bound to have a couple of people come a cropper. And kind of ironically, it was his teammate being in the wall that brought about the situation, really, with the safety car and the red flag and everything. So that's a little ironic, and not Sims's fault. Yet again, the victim of some bad luck and a driver maybe being a little overly aggressive with his attacking and defending. Because let's be honest, he could have done with an inch or two more going through turn 6. But fair play, the steward saw nothing wrong with it.
Right. And do we want to talk about the stewards? Do we want to go there yet? Because I'm not sure. How do you want to pick apart the whole end of the race? I mean, or maybe we should talk about Lauderer first. Well, let's talk about Lauderer. He had a really good result today.
Yeah, I mean, going up from 7th to 4th in a race where we didn't actually see that much overtaking was really quite impressive. I think, he's able to just kind of pick the people off. And I think it's a testament to Techeetah's pace that weekend, because we can't deny it was a very strong car on this track. So there's that to consider into it. But he also really did get his elbows out where he needed to, barging his way past Daniel Abt at the hairpin as well. And I get no action from the stewards again, so it's clearly I'm very, very much on the limit. Although you could make an argument that move was made because of contact, but we saw Roland do a very similar move in Hong Kong on Daniel Abt as well, and take no penalty for it. So I'm sure Daniel is going to get pretty fed up of being barged out the way at some point.
Well, he'll hardly be the only one getting fed up with the stewards and what they are and aren't going to allow. So why don't you go ahead? And there had already been a lot of contact. There had already been people out of the race. There had already been bits of race car all over the track. But why don't you go ahead and set up the end of the race, the crucial factors, and what happened afterwards?
Yeah, so this is all kind of in the battle for the middle of the top 10 at this point, and it's, Di Grassi, Frantz, and Buemi still squabbling away for position. Buemi having come up from his pit lane start to about 8th place, and in that lead battle is frankly quite astonishing. I know, there was the safety car on the red flag really, really helped him, but he still caught up to that pack. So they were knocking 7 bells out of each other and holding each other up, so that might have helped. But even so, that was an astonishing recovery drive up until the contact with Frantz. I think he just went into the back of him. They'll say that he was moving under braking. To be honest, it's very, very difficult to tell from the shots we have available at the moment. I'm sure when Formula E does its onboard compilations and its team radio reactions, we'll get a few more angles and be able to look at it a little bit more closely. As much as I'd love to play a game of whose fault is it right now, I really don't think I could. But the contact between them, they're suddenly, going full speed into a hairpin, unable to stop. And Lucas Di Grassi is unfortunately en route to the scene of their incident and gets completely wiped out of the race. So much so that, the drive shaft is knocked out. You could hear he was trying to get going again, and you just hear this clunk, clunk, clunk sound as he tries to get going.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what struck me. The most fascinating thing, and this happened after the red flag, Brains took his attack mode straight away. So that by time the race was started, he had used both of them. But everybody else around him waited till they felt like the car was going to come in. And so he was the only person running without attack mode. And that let Degrassi by him and left him vulnerable to Buemi. So do we have any insight? Did anyone ever bother to ask him why he took attack mode when he did?
See, I think you got to kind of guess when the safety car's coming in. There could be an argument that it could be strategy or something, because if you get to use up the attack mode under safety car, it doesn't cost you any energy, crucially. Although by that point it should have been a flat out race, so energy shouldn't really be something that's kind of on your mind. It should be flat out to the finish. So the only thing I can think of it being is that they thought the safety car was going to come in that lap, and you have to guesstimate it, because like in Mexico and in Hong Kong, for example, the attack mode was later in the lap. So by the time you got to it, you already had the message, safety car coming in this lap. And they tell the drivers, right, take attack mode now. But because this was only at turn 2 this time, you have to guess it.
Yeah, that makes a certain amount of sense. But they were the only team to do it when they did. Everybody else waited. So I just wonder if somehow they felt like they weren't going to be able to make any use of it at all. So they just wanted to make sure they got rid of it with no time loss. And that brings up a second thing that I wanted to ask you, because it got mentioned. I think Dario Franchitti mentioned it in the commentary, which is about the cars behind the safety car actually having a harder time cooling the batteries than when they are racing, because the amount of air flowing over them is so very, very much less. Is that the case? Do you know?
There's always going to be less air when you're following another car. It's the same as the slipstream effect. The reason the slipstream is powerful is because the car in front is punching a hole in the air that you're then driving through. So there's less air resistance. But less air resistance also means that there's generally less air going over your car, and therefore into all your cooling ducts and your radiators. So I don't think it's as much of an effect as, say, in Formula One, for example, where they do punch very big holes in the air, whereas these cars are designed to cleanly cut through the air with minimal resistance. But nonetheless, that slipstream effect is still there, and it's going to have some sort of an impact. We know how fine the margins can be with these battery temperatures in particular. I don't think so much at this race, but it was on the hotter end of the scale. But it wasn't a situation like Santiago, for example, where that was the defining factor of that race, but still a contributor to the overall result, I think.
Yeah, well, it was just an interesting nugget to consider, that perhaps being behind the safety car didn't allow the cars to cool the batteries as much as you might think. Because normally you think of the regen as adding most of the thermal energy to the battery when the energy flows into it. But Franchitti was saying that no, even behind the safety car, sometimes the batteries won't really cool at all, just simply because the radiators are massively inefficient at those slow speeds.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. You have two factors going in there. You don't have as much air going through because you're going slower, so the air going in is not as much. But then you're also regenerating more and using less energy. And we all know the faster you charge something, the hotter it gets. If anybody's got a phone with one of those superchargers, you'll know how hot your phone gets when you charge it. 5 years ago with a regular charger, it never used to get that hot. The first time I used one, I thought my phone was going to explode. I'd never experienced it. It just picked up and suddenly it's really, really hot. It's the same effect.
All right, so let's go talk about the Twitter feud. But before we do, what exactly is the actual rule about moving under braking? Do you know?
Well, it says in every single race, there is the race director's notes that says repeated moves of direction will not be tolerated. And I guess that has to apply under the braking move rule, because it's a general FIA rule. All FIA series will say don't move under braking. But I think Formula E they have different rules in Formula E because in addition to contact as well, Formula One, because contact is so costly, they have to come down on it a little bit harder. I mean, you'll see some incidents, even between F1 and F2. You'll see incidents in F1 that wouldn't have been penalised in F2, for example, vice versa. Formula E gets a bit of a green light on quite a lot of things because it is pretty much a contact sport, because the cars are very robust. They're not really aero dependent. They are more compared to what they used to be, which is where some of these problems are arising. As I mentioned last week, these cars are a little bit too susceptible to damage, and it seems like there are quite a lot of people in the paddock who agree with that statement. But generally, I would say don't move under braking, but Formula E seems to give it a bit of a green light. But the drivers will disagree with that, because there's not a whole lot you can do at that point.
No, indeed, there's not. But the interesting thing for me is, having gone and looked at this for a while, a while ago, excuse me, I can state that unless it's changed since I last looked at the International Sporting Code, there is absolutely positively in the rule book no rule whatsoever about moving under braking. None. I think that's more of a driver rule or a general understanding than it is a specified rule in any rule book that I have ever read. Now, obviously, that's quite a statement. I'm sure people will tell me I'm wrong. And if you have evidence, cite me chapter and verse, tweet me at MattPT55 on the internet, because I want to see it. Last time I looked, it wasn't there. There's a rule in Formula One. Obviously, you can only make one defensive move, but you're allowed to retake the racing line into a corner. And beyond that, the corners are always matters of substantive judgment of the stewards based on what they see occurring and the telemetry.
This is very true, but then there's the big difference between taking up your line but then also covering the inside under braking after the car behind has already gone for a move, which is kind of the big thing here. That was what was so on the limit about the Bird Lotterer contact that we saw in Hong Kong that took so long to resolve. So it's, where do you draw the line? Because in that instance, the car behind got the penalty. So each incident is always going to be really different, and it's going to be treated very differently. It's worth saying that Buemi was the one who got the penalty for this one, a 10-second time penalty that dropped him to, well, pretty much to the position he was in already, back to 8th place, which Audi were not impressed with, not least Hans-Jürgen Abt, the one of the owners of the Audi Abt team. So yeah, he was not impressed. He said it should have been a much harsher penalty, because if you're in 8th, cause a collision, gain 2 places, and then only end up 8th because of a penalty anyway. He actually described it as more of an incentive than a penalty, because he hasn't lost anything effectively, has he? It's a bit like was it the US Grand Prix last year when Carlos Sainz just drove off the track, gained a bunch of places, and only got a 5-second time penalty, which was way less than what he gained pulling that maneuver. So if anybody remembers that, that's maybe a little bit of a comparison for you.
Yeah, well, actually, I go back a bit further. I remember it might have been Hamilton and Alonso going at it, and Hamilton getting a penalty that required him to enter the pit lane and driving around and literally making up almost a pit stop, and then coming through and basically emerging in the same place that he started out in. And there was no end of complaints on the radio about that. And they actually changed it, and now I think you have to serve those types of penalties within a lap or two of them being applied. But you bring up how unhappy Abt is. I'm fairly sure Frains wasn't exactly happy about that either, because he was on for a really good result as well. Buemi, by all accounts, being the driver behind, regardless of when he moved, was going so fast and had enough energy that he basically got shoved through the corner and into Degrassi, who then compounded things for the race, because I assume we want to talk about Twitter after we get to the end of the race. Compounded things for the race by exiting his vehicle and and sort of spoiling the last lap or two.
Yeah, I mean, I can't blame him really. I mean, it is the rule, you have to stay in the car until the marshals get to you, and he was fined for exiting the car. Um, I don't think him exiting the car really brought out the safety car, because that car was stuck there regardless. He wasn't going to drive it away. The marshals, weren't going to pull it away whether he was in the car or not. So I don't think that him coming out really affected the end of the race. I mean, that was pretty inevitable at that point, not least because there's debris everywhere as well. So yeah, I think it was pretty inevitable. And what then happened for France, because he was having a really great race. He had quite a low grid spot. Virgin didn't seem to come here with a whole lot of pace in qualifying anyway. But then France really turned it up for the race and gained up quite a few positions. Great start as well to put him in that position. So really, really good drive from him. And I'm sure he will see himself as the one. Obviously, Lucas is the most innocent in all this, but France will probably not apportion much blame onto himself, because, even if, Buemi will claim he was moving under braking, he will say, well, that's fair game. As I'm sure a lot of drivers will when they're doing it. And then when it happens to them, they might suddenly change their feelings about it. But certainly Lucas felt this was the case. It seemed like him and Seb had a bit of a chat. And Seb was saying, yeah, he was moving under braking all the time. And that, that contact was just inevitable at that point.
Of course, if you're trail braking, you will be moving under braking, won't you?
Well, I mean, if you're going to get technical.
Yeah, I know. But the thing is, the one view that we had of it proper, it was clear, first of all, that France had not gone as far over as Buemi, and that he was actually moving back out, it looked to me, to take the racing line into whatever turn that was. Was it turn 8, the hairpin? Yeah. And that's when the contact happened, because you can see they were different angles relative to the straight. But what fascinates me is that Degrassi basically pretty much came right out and blamed France for this instead of Buemi. And did he just not look at the video? Does he not care? And let's face it, he banged into France pretty hard when he went past him a couple of laps before that.
Yeah, I think his initial thought would have been, what on earth? France has just absolutely sideswiped me, because he won't have seen the whole Buemi thing unfolding in his mirrors, really. But I'm sure by the time the Twitter feud happened, he will have watched it back. Because obviously at that point he'd been speaking to Seb as well, because he's referencing things Seb has told him. And France was very nonchalant about the whole thing. Whereas Lucas, you could see very, very upset, not least because of inconsistent stewarding he feels as well. And I can totally see where he's coming from, because it's that whole thing of what we talked about after the Hong Kong race, whether you're penalizing an incident or if you're penalizing a consequence of an incident. And the latter is not great, but neither is the former in the current situation we have, because contact is just happening everywhere and you almost need it to make a pass at the moment, especially when you land yourself in a situation where you've got 8 cars all bunched up together in a flat out race to the finish because there's been a safety car, and it's really, really hard to overtake. And you can do all this moving around in the braking zone stuff, and it's super easy to defend. So you've got to get inventive. And this stuff is just going to keep happening, I think, until they change something. And there's not a whole lot they can do with the cars to make them, less sensitive to damage. Really, the thing they've got to do is kind of come down on this moving under braking thing. They can't just bang contact, because then you'll see no racing at all. There'll just be no wheel-to-wheel action whatsoever. So, yeah, there's got to be some hard and fast rule at some point.
Yeah, I think there needs to be an understanding amongst the drivers and amongst the stewards about different types of contact. I mean, there's incidental contact that you'll see when two cars just go into a corner side by side, and there's not quite enough room, or neither one of them has particularly great grip, and there's just sliding around. Then there's contact that might look a little more intentional, like when Degrassi went past Frangs, but it's basically side by side, headed towards a turn, rubbing is racing kind of contact. But contact like we saw Buemi make, or quite frankly, like we saw Degrassi make when he tried to take, when he entirely inadvertently ran into Buemi in the championship race. I think they are treating that as a different sort of contact. At least that's what I'm getting. Do you think that's the same thing? Are they going to codify this? And does that make sense given the constraints of the sport?
The thing is, so on the World Feed, they had Scott Elkins on the grid being interviewed by the team, and he was quite clear about it. We're not penalising the consequence of incidents. We are penalising incidents, especially, and the one that sticks with me as well is incidents where positions are gained because of contact. But there were two of them by Lotterer alone in that race, and nothing. So I don't fully understand it, and I'm sure the drivers equally have questions as well, because by that logic, Lotterer should have had two penalties. So I see what you mean, like where the Buemi, France, and Degrassi incident is obviously in a completely different league to the Lotterer incident with Apt, for example, where he gave him a little nudge and made up a place. I think they're more glancing over that. And it's the more serious issues that they have to stamp out, and they'll just let the drivers deal with their own petty squabbles, as I'm sure they're seen as by some people.
Highly entertaining petty squabbles. So what has happened on Twitter? Catch me up. Has there been any more fireworks? I mean, I noticed that Vern got himself involved.
Yeah, well, I think most people did. I mean, DaCosta was just kind of sitting back and laughing about it, really, wasn't he? That was the feeling I got from him. But the one thing I kind of took from it was the one consistency about it was that drivers felt that penalties were being inconsistent, and they don't know what they're going to get away with anymore, which I think worries them, because every time they try something, they're going to be like, "Am I going to get a penalty for this now?" Oh, screw it. I'll just bomb it and argue my point later, which is the number one rule in racing. But I think I've kind of already said I have to say about the Twitter feud. To be honest, drivers are unhappy with penalties. Lucas is very unhappy with Robin, and very much points the finger at him, I feel.
Fair enough. So before we go, you did mention there was a lot of contact. There was a couple of key retirements that we haven't bothered to mention at all. And there seemed to be a very long list of people being investigated for things. So do you have a conclusive list for us of that?
In terms of incidents, really, Buemi was the only one.
Okay, so it's the only one with the penalty, because there were a lot of investigations announced right at the end of the race.
Yeah, yes. So, Lotterer, Sims, nothing. And Lotterer and Apt was nothing, as we mentioned. The key one, though, pre-race championship leader Sam Bird out on lap 1 because of contact. This is huge. This is hugely significant for the championship, because this is part of the reason why Vern is suddenly in championship contention, because, DaCosta's made up, 15 points on Bird. Vern's made up 25 and hauled himself up. The key thing as well is the Mahindras didn't perform very well. We'll get into them later. And with Degrassi not scoring points as well, suddenly it's back even standings in the championship again. It's not as close as it was in Hong Kong, but we suddenly got a lot more key contenders coming in there, more people that we expected at the beginning of the season as well. So it was the incident with Van Dorn, who went into the back of him. But I think Bird was already going into the back of the Dragon anyway. I think it was Jose Maria Lopez. So the stewards didn't find anyone to portion more blame on, really. So they kind of let that one go. But hugely significant for the championship.
Yeah, well, if I'm remembering correctly, the context of that was a full course yellow where everyone slammed on their brakes.
Well, they were going into turn 5 anyway. It's a big stop. Um, I'm not entirely sure. Again, the onboard videos that come out later in the week will probably help us out with it. How much of that incident was Bird already going into the back of the Dragon
Yeah.
that caught Van Dorn out, or whether Van Dorn was braking super late anyway. It seemed to be an element of that anyway, but it could also have been the fact that Bird was suddenly stopping because he's hit another car.
Yeah, well, that does tend to help having all those extra wheels to slow you down. So you mentioned Van Dorn. How did our other F1 alumni do this race?
So Van Dorn out, unfortunately, again. There's not much more you can say about the guy. He needs a break, like seriously, because even in Hong Kong, when he should have like at least bare minimum got a top 5 out of that race, probably even a podium, you can't get a break. But Felipe Massa picked up a point after his teammate Eduardo Mortara was penalised for not using attack mode twice. I think what's happened here is, so we didn't talk about Degrassi failing to take attack mode twice. I think Mortara was a victim of the same issue, because I seem to remember him going for it and then maybe it not taken. And I got to say, I'm not sure how I feel about how I understand you've got to hit a certain window. All right. And like on Mario Kart, that super speed strip doesn't go across the whole track. It's only one small narrow window that you got to aim for. But I think if your right wheel is 2 inches off the track, you should still get attack mode. That irked me quite a bit in that race, to be honest, because it takes cars out of the thick of it. And suddenly they're dropping 5 seconds because they have to take attack mode 3 times. So I think Mortara was a victim of that same issue as well, because he was on for a better point score than 10th, really. He was sort of about 8th place. But the Buemi, Fraintz, and Degrassi incident, he kind of got caught up in that. You see, he sort of made contact with Degrassi's car as he was going around the hairpin, and that lost him a place or 2 as well. But then that penalty just completely knocked him out the points and down to 13th and last, effectively, with Robin, the only other car. But all to the benefit of his teammate, picks up another point. And Pascal Wehrlein, just behind Jerome D'Ambrosio, actually, P7 and P6 for them. Mahindra not on form. And like we saw in Hong Kong as well, not great speed from them, which is worrying because it all sounds eerily similar to what we saw from Mahindra last season, where they started off with a fantastically quick car, arguably the quickest, and it's really slipped away from them, and it costing them championship contention, really. Now, that said, Jerome is still second in the championship, 1 point away from new leader Antonio Felix da Costa. But Pascal needs to be scoring big, because he's already had 3 incidents in his first 3 races, or the first 3 races. Obviously, he wasn't at the first race, was he? And didn't score in his first race, and then was penalised in Mexico, of course, as well. And since then, the pace just hasn't been there. So you got to. You got to think that there's something else going on. He says that they need to revert to an older setup, something that was working for them in Mexico, that was working for them in Marrakesh, and Santiago as well. So they do need to find that form again, because this is a case of deja vu at the moment.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting and eerily reminiscent of Ferrari last year, isn't it? Where you have a team that looks fast, they bring an update, and all of a sudden they're just utterly lost. The question is, are they going to continue to push to sort it out, or are they going to revert to just do the best they can with the package that was working while they work it out back at the factory?
Well, the difference here, I think this is more setup related rather than kind of an update. So they haven't bought like a software update and it's made the car worse. It's something that they've kind of tweaked on the setup, thinking it will find them a little bit of speed, and it hasn't quite worked out for them, which obviously they wouldn't have really gotten a sense of in Hong Kong, for example. If it's something they did prior to Hong Kong, then they wouldn't really have seen, yeah, this isn't working, because you could say, well, that could have just been the rain that caused this lack of pace. So this is the first time they've got to properly look at it in a clean, clear weekend. And I think that the fact that Verline has kind of theorized that, it's setup related, we need to go back to this old thing, the team will probably do that.
All right, fair enough. What do you say we head for any other business? I turned it down, I swear. I don't know what's going on with my soundboard today. Anyway, what else do we need to get to before we get out of here?
Don't worry, Matt, I'll edit it and it will sound nice and quiet and people won't have a clue what you're talking about, why it's so low. So Alex Sims out again, as we mentioned, after contact with Andre Lotterer. Another guy who just needs a break, because seriously, like I said last week as well, remember we were talking about the Antonio Felix Acosta and Sims battle, how they're so closely matched by like thousands at a time. It was the same case again this weekend. Nothing between them. So he can win races. He just can. He's proved it already. Give the guy a break. Mitch Evans, fantastic recovery, 20th to 9th. And this is the most praise I've put on Jaguar all season, because it's the first kind of fantastic thing they've done, really. Why they were back in 20th, well, made a mistake in his qualifying lap, but didn't he really? So there's that to consider, but definitely a strong recovery there. Both dragons out with technical issues. They're probably more software related than anything else, rather than mechanical. I think because they both had them at the same time, and we saw Nazar didn't go anywhere off the line for a little bit, and Lopez didn't make it much further. We also got news today that Maxi Gunter is going to be back in Rome, replacing Nazar, who of course has got to be racing a Long Beach IMSA. So Gunther will get one last race before he's axed for good. Can't wait for that. If you can't sense the sarcasm in that, then, well, you haven't picked up the sarcasm in that. For HWA, more issues, again, unfortunately. I think another drive shaft issue. How many times has that Venturi powertrain had the same drive shaft issue? Because they think that's what caused Paffett to retire in this race. So really, Venturi, as much as we've been praising Venturi, the team, the powertrain in its customer car in the HWA still has big reliability problems. So is that a question of how it's being run or inherent issues? Probably a mixture of both, because as we know, HWA are here to learn. And in the championship standings, as I mentioned before, 1 point between DaCosta and D'Ambrosio. Verne is in the hunt, 8 points back. 10 points covers the top 6, which also includes Bird, Degrassi, and Mortara still in there as well. And in the teams championship, 3 points between Virgin, Mahindra, Audi, and Cheetah. This championship is super hot. And there are going to be so many more twists and turns into it, because we're only halfway through the season. Now we've got the whole of Europe to enjoy.
Indeed, and you mentioned 6, and that makes it officially this 6 drivers, 6 teams, 6 races, doesn't it?
6 teams as well. Yeah, exactly. Like when was the last time? This is better than the F1 2012 record of 7 winners and 7 races, because that was different. That wasn't as many teams, was it either? And you know what? We can still go for a 7th. We can do it. If Nissan Edams win in Rome, we'll have a 7th. It's entirely possible still.
Yeah, it's well, after their performance at Sanya, you'd have to say that barring intervention on the technical side, that they do have to be looked at. You got Buemi and Roland. If they have a clear qualifying, then they are obviously a front-running team at this point.
Yeah. No, the real question is going to be, can they handle the race as well? We saw super energy critical it was last season, and it gave us a truly epic scrap for the lead in the dying moments of that race. I cannot wait for Rome again. That honestly was one of the top tracks of last season. And I think it's going to suit these Gen 2 cars pretty well as well. Not so much that last sector. Here's hoping they've made some changes to it, because I didn't like it in the Gen 1 cars, and these cars will be even sillier. But the rest of that lap, fantastic. It's going to provide some great racing, I think.
Right. And that's 3 weeks off, is it not?
It is indeed the 13th of April. Mark your calendars.
All right, then let's move on to the podium. And of course, here on E-Radio, we care not for where you finish in the race, for we hand out a different kind of award. So, Chris Stevens, who for you was, or what, the thing of the weekend?
Ollie Rowland, it's got to be. The guy just keeps on impressing me. His first pole position, and he's absolutely astonishing on race pace. Still, getting the better of Sebastian Buemi, despite the fact that Buemi's been the top dog in Formula E since it started, and Rowland came in with 1 day of wet testing under his belt. Kid just keeps on astonishing.
Fair enough. For me, I got to go with, and this was tough because like Robin Frains was definitely up there. Vern is a real candidate because he came from, as you said, a miserable practice to just nail his race. But I'm going to look a little bit bigger. I'm going to look more forest, less trees. And I'm going to say Formula E was the thing of the weekend. I know the end of the race was a bit disappointing, but when you went over the championship statistics, 6 winners, 6 teams, 6 races, top 4, and what, covered by 3 points on the teams. How many drivers in contention? I mean, name me another series that looks like that.
What a cop-out answer. My thing of the weekend is the series itself. We may as well say, well, my thing of the weekend was the YouTube stream.
All right, fine. Be that way. Championship standings. Come on. You got to cheerlead a little bit. That's impressive. And really, name me another series. I'm waiting.
Well, Formula 2 starts this weekend, so we'll see how that one pans out over the first few races, because that could be quite a hotly contested championship between.
After 6 races, we'll compare. Fair enough.
And is that 6 round or 6 feature races, or the first 3 races, or what? We deal with sprints or what?
We'll call them 6 events, so 6 weekends. Both races make one event.
Good. Okay, good. Glad we can see eye to eye on that.
Absolutely. And so, who for you missed the apex?
Quite a few people.
A lot of people very much missed the apex. But go ahead. I'm waiting.
I think, unfortunately, it's going to be Neo, because they were just kind of non-existent this weekend. Still, no speed. And no speed. Even in a race like this, where you've got the top 10 that are knocking 7 bells out of each other, and they just have no way into that. And it's hugely frustrating, not least for them. But we want to see them up there. We really do want to see them up there, and it's a huge shame. I see Esteban in the chat room has come to my aid about which competitive championship we might have. MotoGP is surely that's going to be the one that is going to blow this out of the water. Maybe, I don't know. It'll probably be Marquez 5 out of 5 in the next few races, as far as we're concerned. I've just jinxed it. Sorry, MotoGP fans.
I will hereby disallow that answer because not enough wheels.
Oh, come on. 2 is plenty.
All right. It's interesting. Who missed the apex this weekend? And I'm tempted to say you did, because in your Formula One alumni wrap-up, you failed to mention everybody's favorite Formula One driver, Nelson Piquet Jr., who quite literally missed the apex, and this is why I bring you up tangentially, and drove into a wall, as far as I know. Now, was there anything else behind that, or was that just really pretty much a cell phone?
I think, as far as I'm aware, it was a sort of driver incident. I haven't heard anything to the contrary. But thank you for throwing me under the bus. I felt like, Jaguar's story of the weekend for me was Mitch Evans going right up there, because Piquet wasn't even up there as well. And I know Evans screwed up his lap, but I don't think Nelson did. And
Yeah, yeah.
worrying
Well,
face from Nelson.
it's whatever. It's a race. It's a race. It's a race. And I think everybody missed it because it happened right before the whole Buemi, Frains, Di Grassi thing. But he just basically drove into a wall.
Yeah.
And everyone was like, oh, look, Nelson's driven into a wall. Oh, my goodness, what has happened here?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was that. So I have to say, on the weekend where your teammate goes from 20th to 9th and you manage to drive into a wall, is not going to be your weekend.
You have to wonder, if Nelson's going to stick around, because I mentioned, I think I mentioned a few weeks ago that because I think this driver market is going to heat up quite quickly, because I think there are suddenly going to be some drivers who are realizing that some of their prospects aren't necessarily going anywhere, and they're going to start sniffing around for other things, especially with 2 new teams coming in. So that is 4. Well, actually, no, Yanni's already confirmed. So there's 3 seats up for grabs that I think quite a few guys, especially those in the lower end teams, are going to start really competing for.
And fair enough. It may be that what made Nelson so desirable as a driver has been lost in the transition to the second generation cars a bit, because he really seems to have just been lost with his team this year.
Yeah, and there's at the moment no explanation for his lack of pace, especially compared to Mitch. We know Mitch he's the golden boy. He is the guy who should have so many better results than he has. But whereas Nelson last year with the same machinery wasn't able to do what Mitch did, on a completely different tire that Nelson has admitted he really didn't like. But nonetheless, is a better tire for him now, and he's still not performing.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. How long they'll wait for him to get comfortable on the tire before they just go out and find somebody else who already is. So Chris, where can we catch you? What are you up to? Plug all of the things.
So you can find me on Twitter at Chris on Racing. I've got quite a few things coming up, actually. So next weekend, I think it is 6th of April, I'll be back at Simply Race, where Missed Apex Podcast just had its sim event, commentating on the 12 hours of Nürburgring with their LMP2 cars. That's part of the Simply Race Endurance series. And of course, you can check me out on Missed Apex Podcast, where we just did the Australian Grand Prix race review last weekend. And then a few days ago, we did a news show. And as we speak, Spanners is talking to Joe Sayward, so there'll be another episode of that coming up as well.
And don't forget the karting. We have the karting coming up, and I believe there are maybe a few spots left.
Definitely. There are seats left. So it's £79 where we're doing 3 heats and a final. It's a fantastic format. If you saw anything from the Buckmore Park karting event we did last summer, you'll know it's truly, truly awesome. And we don't have too many spots left, but it is so worth getting on the reserves list, because last year we did have a couple of last minute dropouts. So if you want to be on the reserve list, you absolutely can. But we do still have some spots available. So get in touch with Spanners if you want to get in on that. And I highly recommend you do.
Yes, it is a lot of fun. Even if you are a novice karter, even if you've never done it before, it's a great atmosphere. People are all very nice. And I believe they'll even record a live show to boot, so you get to be part of that as well. As for me, I'm at MattPT55 on the Twitters. Go buy my wife's most excellent book, The One I Love to Hate, on the Amazons or the Barnes & Nobles or your e-seller of choice. That's at A Weaver Writes on the Twitters if you want to say hi to her. And don't forget to catch us, eRadio, on Twitter, at eRadio Show. And if you're part of our Missed Apex Slack group, be sure to join the Formula E channel as well. And remember, chicks dig heels, wounds cause scars, and glory is a fungible concept under certain philosophical precepts. This has been eRadio Show.